Thank you everybody for joining us today for today's webinar, Choosing Your Building Upgrade Zone, Structural Equity Considerations. I'm Diana Morales, I go by D, and I'm a research analyst on the local policy team at ACEEE. And today I'm joined by Michael Reiner from the Office of Economic Impact and Diversity from the Department of Energy. So we're going to start off with some messages from our interpreters to go over interpretation. So I'll hand it over to you, Jordi.
Para escuchar el canal de interpretación, haz clic en el icono del globo y escoge el canal de tu preferencia. Si le seleccionas apagado, escucharás el lenguaje original. To listen to the interpreter, please select the globe icon and choose the language of your preference. If you choose off, you will hear the original language. Thank you. Gracias.
Great, thank you very much. And now we're going to move on to a couple of housekeeping announcements before getting started. So just that folks are aware, we're going to be recording this webinar and it will be made available to all registrants within a few business days following the presentation. To ask questions during the webinar, please submit it via the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. You're also able to upvote some questions in the Q&A box. If you would like us to prioritize some questions, that'll be a good way to indicate which ones we should get to. Please use the chat to engage in respectful and productive discussion with other participants. So some on the R2E2 code of conduct. R2E2 will not tolerate behaviors that cause harm or disrupt the learning environment. Please direct messages to Stephanie Sosa-Coulter if you feel unsafe in this space. Disruptive participants may be removed from the webinar. All right, so now I'm going to hand it over to Cassie Grimes of the U.S. Department of Building Technologies Office to give us a few points on the Buildings Upgrade Prize.
Thank you, Dee, and thank you all for joining us today. We can go to the next slide. So the Buildings Upgrade Prize, or Buildings Up, is designed to rapidly scale energy efficiency and efficient electrification upgrades to existing buildings all across the country. This is not a prize to upgrade a single building, but rather to develop an initiative that will complete many building upgrades in your building upgrade zone. The prize is envisioned to consist of 4 phases over approximately 5 years, subject to approvals and the availability of funds. We're currently in phase 1, the concept phase of the prize, which will award over $22 million in cash prizes and technical assistance to teams. Applications for phase 1 opened February 18th, and they'll be closing on July 18th, 2023. We're seeking 20 to 60 winning teams to join the Buildings Up co-opetition. We call it a co-opetition rather than a competition because we're not looking to crown a single winning team at the end. Instead, we hope to see as many teams as possible move through the prize phases successfully. To address this challenge, we're going to need all hands on deck, working together and sharing our best ideas with one another to move farther and faster together. Buildings Up is a capacity building prize that will support teams to develop solutions that accelerate building upgrades beyond current best practices, are scalable and replicable, are built to last beyond the period of the prize. And Buildings Up also seeks to benefit underserved communities by ensuring that at least 40% of prize benefits accrue to what we call equity eligible buildings, their occupants, and the surrounding community. And we'll get more into that definition in a later slide. Next slide, please. Buildings Up applicants are asked to select one of 2 pathways. The equity-centered innovation pathway will award $400,000 in cash prizes for each winning team. For this pathway, teams will commit at least 80% of their building upgrade initiative implementation on equity-eligible buildings. The open innovation pathway will award $200,000 in cash prizes for each winning team. For this pathway, applicants are not required to focus on equity-eligible buildings. Technical assistance to build out concept submissions into full implementation plans will be provided to all winning teams in the next phase. Next slide. For the purposes of this prize, equity eligible buildings are defined based on 4 different categories to meet the requirements of the equity-centered innovation pathway. The first category is by geographic location. So this includes buildings located within Justice 40 census tracts, tribal lands, both federally and non-federally recognized, and US territories. The second category is affordable housing and housing occupied by low-income residents. The third is underserved commercial, nonprofit, and public buildings. And the fourth is team-defined. We recognize that there may be specific local conditions or considerations that could make buildings in a given area also equity eligible that might not fit within the other 3 categories. Additional information about equity eligible buildings can be found in section 3.5 of the official rules document, which we'll be linking to where you can find that either in the chat or on one of the slides later on, and I'll post it in the chat later. Next slide, please. Teams should identify their building upgrade zone, which is the place where they intend to complete building upgrades. The building upgrade zone includes a geographic boundary, which can encompass an entire community, neighborhoods within a community, a utility service area, a portfolio of geographically dispersed buildings would also fit in this. In this case, the boundary might be an entire state or a region where the buildings are located. And the second category is specific building types where you intend to address within the boundary that you identified. So you want to specifically call out what types of buildings, whether that's single family homes utilizing fuel oil or propane, multifamily buildings that might be utilizing inefficient electric or gas heating and or cooling equipment, small commercial buildings that have rooftop units. You may also be trying to address all of the buildings within your given boundary, and all of these would be considered your building upgrade zone. I do want to call out the note that strong concept plans are going to include many buildings in the building upgrade zone rather than a single building retrofit. Concept plans should outline upgrade initiatives that are going to impact a lot of buildings, is the main point we want to make. Next slide, please. This slide provides several examples of different project types that applicants could propose for the Buildings Upgrade Prize. For example, a community-based organization in a mid-sized town could partner with their local government to bring heat pumps to affordable housing buildings in their community. For all of the proposed initiatives, we're especially seeking innovation in overcoming persistent and non-technical barriers. The minimum technologies that should be included in your Buildings Upgrade initiative is efficient heating and cooling equipment. So that includes heat pumps and heat pump water heaters, as well as weatherization and envelope improvements, such as insulation, air sealing, window improvements, wherever needed to reduce energy costs. Next slide, please. Buildings Up is seeking innovation in overcoming challenges such as lack of contractor and occupant familiarity with technologies, high upfront costs for upgrades, insufficient workforce to scale upgrades, and lack of reach of funding and incentive programs, among a lot of other challenges. Next slide. So here we have the link and the QR code posted for how to access more information about the Buildings Upgrade Prize. That's also where you can read the rules, you can follow the prize and apply for phase 1. The next informational webinar where we'll be going more in depth on all aspects of the prize rules, eligibility, and scoring is going to be on Tuesday, June 13th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. Registration is available on HeroX for that session, and we also have recordings of all of the previous sessions posted there as well. Thank you, and I'll hand it back over to Dee.
Great, thank you so much. And yeah, we'll get started on today's webinar. Once again, thank you for joining us today. My name is Diana Morales. I'm a research analyst at ACEEE, and I'm joined today by Michael Rayner of the Office of Economic Impact and Diversity. So we're going to start off with an icebreaker to get us started. If you could please put in the chat your name, pronouns, organization, as well as the answer to the following icebreaker, which is what motivates you to keep doing work in housing, buildings, and/or energy issues. The reason I chose this icebreaker was because we're going to be talking about some pretty serious topics today. So I'd like to start off with an icebreaker to help ground us in the reasons that we do the work that we do. So I'll give folks a couple of seconds to put their answers in the chat before moving on to the next slides. Okay, great. Thank you for those who have put in their answers already. I'll move on to the next slide. So we know that most of you are here to learn about considerations and things that you need to understand to submit a strong application for the Buildings Upgrade Prize. So I'd like to spend a few minutes talking about the connection of what we're talking about today, and specifically what you're going to be asked to consider in your applications. So if you look at the rules document on the HeroX website, you'll eventually come to a few tables in that document that are broken up into two columns, as you can see here on my screen. The column on the left includes suggested content for your team to provide in your application narratives, which make up the larger concept plan. The column on the right includes statements that reviewers will be using to score your overall concept plan. The reviewers will be using a 1 to 6 scale to indicate how strongly they agree with the content and how much it was covered. So 1 will be strongly disagree, all the way up to 6 being strongly agree. And as you can see here at the top of the table in blue, you can see one of the criterion that's especially relevant to today's conversation, which falls under assessing and prioritizing challenges. So for this criterion, you'll need to show that you have a clearly defined building upgrade zone, which Cassie just covered in the last couple of slides. And also that you've assessed and understand what to prioritize, what challenges to prioritize in your building upgrade zone. So if the reviewers agree that you fully covered and demonstrated a thoughtful understanding of the bullets on the right, you should be looking at scores of 6. So some examples of specific areas you'll need to cover are that you'll need to demonstrate an understanding and have clearly defined your building upgrade zone, and demonstrate that you have an understanding of the types of buildings that are going to be addressed within that upgrade zone. You'll need to show that your team demonstrates a comprehensive understanding of the challenges to energy and efficient electrification in the building upgrade zone. You'll also need to show that your team has sought out diverse stakeholder perspectives, including with historically marginalized communities, to assess and understand the challenges to building upgrades. And so as you can see in these scoring statements, it's important for your team to define the area of your building upgrade zone, which includes information on the specific communities, which we'll define in upcoming slides, and the building types within the upgrade zone. It's also crucial to understand the challenges to the building upgrade zones in the area that you will be focusing on for your concept plans. So for more on the official buildings up rules and a longer list of the criterion that I covered here, you can go to the HeroX website. and refer to the statements where you will be assessed. So with that background, I'll now cover the learning goals for today's webinar. So the goal for today's sessions are to learn about policies that have created housing and other inequities. In their application, teams will need to demonstrate a comprehensive understanding of the challenges and describe them in detail. We'll also see how these inequities are present in the geography of communities and apply this knowledge to your local context. This will help teams understand challenges and help teams describe the building upgrade zone, characteristics of the buildings, and the communities within the building upgrade zone. And understanding these inequities and explaining the challenges also presents teams with an opportunity to describe how their concept plans can offer multiple benefits and take deliberate steps to think about ways to prevent continuing inequities. Related to this is also the goal of applying knowledge to your local context, which can be a useful step in preventing potential negative impacts of your concept plans. Negative impacts from seemingly beneficial programs often happens when we don't have an understanding that is rooted in historical political context of past actions that have enabled current inequities. So in other words, understanding how inequities were created in the past can help us prevent future harms. In this session, we'll also go over some data tools that can be useful for explaining how your team came to prioritize challenges, as well as describe the characteristics of the buildings in your upgrade zone. And ultimately, we hope that teams will use this knowledge of challenges, buildings, and community characteristics, key stakeholders, and context to prepare a comprehensive concept plan for the building's upgrade prize. So here is our agenda for today. We'll start with an introduction to Justice 40 and energy equity to lay the foundations of the presentation. Once we cover that, we'll move on to looking at structural inequities through historical policy to apply real-world examples of how inequities show up that the prize could start challenging. We'll then move on to sections that discuss how to apply available data and tools to choose the building upgrade zone, including through lived experience and qualitative data. And then we'll round out the conversation with some action items and next steps. So with that, I'll hand it over to Michael to go over the Justice 40 initiative.
Great, thanks, Dee. To tee up the conversation, I wanted to begin with providing a little context on what prioritizing communities looks like from the federal perspective. For much of this work at the Department of Energy, we're using the lens guided by the Justice 40 initiative. I suspect lots of folks on this webinar right now are familiar with the Justice 40 initiative, so I want to provide just a quick overview as it relates to the Buildings Up prize. Justice 40 initiative was created via one of the president's first executive orders titled Tackling the Climate Crisis at Home. Justice 40 calls for 40% of the benefits of certain federal investments to flow towards disadvantaged communities. And so this is essentially calling upon federal agencies to figure out how we can better align our resources to support communities based on need, not just the technical merit of an application. For the purposes of this webinar, we're really focusing on that third category, which involves identifying disadvantaged communities to prioritize through the building upgrade zones. Next slide. Recognizing that the intentions of Justice 40 often may feel a bit abstract, I think that this prize is the perfect example of Justice 40 in action. And so this slide is kind of just presenting what it looks like to map the Building Ups prize to the Justice 40 framework. Using this framework, the prize is that first category of identifying federal investments. The 40% of benefits is realized via the 2 tracks, with the goal of having the benefits from the equity track add up to accrue to about 40%. And then lastly, when we talk about targeting or identifying disadvantaged communities, in this context, we're referring to the building upgrade zone. Next slide. So what does it exactly mean to say disadvantaged communities? How do we define that? And what are the implications of that definition? And so since the Justice 40 initiative was created through the White House, I'm just sharing how it's defined via the guidance through that. And so community can be defined 2 ways. The first one being based on a geographic entity. And this would be where you see concentrations at a census tract that might experience certain burdens. And this one is kind of like the geographic mapping tool, where census tracts are identified as being a disadvantaged community based on satisfying a certain threshold of a burden. So high energy costs would be an example of such a threshold. The second definition for a community is more of a dispersed set of individuals that share common characteristics. As we know, census tracts aren't necessarily the best reflection of the boundaries of a community, and they're oftentimes investments that we don't want to be aggregated in concentrated areas. And so this aspect of the definition allows for indicators such as where affordable housing is located to be dispersed around a broader area that can be involved in our definition. And so for the building uprise, we're trying to use a hybrid approach of combining both the definitions and really create the space and opportunity for communities to identify a zone that's most fitting for their work. Next slide. And again, just keeping it at a high level, the goal here with Justice 40 initiative and our approach at DOE is to try to follow a data-driven approach towards identifying building zones that could benefit the greatest from this prize. This framework is intended to foster projects that reflect both the needs and interests of communities, and the success of building decarbonization writ large should really coalesce and center around that identity of a community. I think it's really critical, as we all know in our work, to make sure we're connecting those dots so people understand our intentions and where building decarbonization fits into the broader scheme of progress. And all of this is critical so that we can actuate change and build that local capacity to continue onwards outside of individual projects here and there. And together, this is meant to reflect more of a bottom-up approach to how we look at the energy transition that centers communities at the heart of it. Back to you, Dee.
Great, thanks so much, Michael. Yeah, so now I'd like to spend some time talking about a framework that ACEEE has used to specify different components of what an equitable energy system could look like, and how this relates to the topic of the webinar. So the current framework that ACEEE uses was adapted through a framework developed by the U.S. Sustainability Directors Network. And this framework has 4 pillars, as you can see here: structural, procedural, distributional, and transgenerational. So we'll go through each of these pillars, giving an example of each. So the first one here, structural equity, involves decision makers recognizing the historical, cultural, and institutional dynamics that have led to clean energy inequities. Taken a step further, this can go beyond recognition of harms to creating things like accountability frameworks to analyze historical and existing inequities, and perform things like equity analysis that can inform program or policy design. For example, the city of Richmond, Virginia, developed an equity screening tool to develop the degree to which proposed climate actions prioritize equitable outcomes. This tool allows users to visualize factors that have made communities more susceptible to climate change and helps the city prioritize different areas in the city. Won't go into that in too much detail here, but we have put this in the list of resources for all of you to read on the development of this tool and its application to climate planning and initiatives in the city. So the next pillar is procedural equity, and this can involve decision makers intentionally creating inclusive and accessible processes for developing and implementing clean energy initiatives. An example of this could be something like creating a community advisory board, which can function as a body composed of community members or community-based organizations that are empowered to have decision-making abilities alongside traditional decision makers to create or change energy-focused programs. Distributional equity ensures that clean energy initiatives fairly distribute the benefits and burdens across all segments of communities. An example of this can be done through something called a gap analysis. And to quote the Northeast Energy Efficiency Partnerships resource that we list at the end of this presentation, this type of analysis is already common in many fields, including health and racial equity impact assessments. This analysis can identify pre-existing conditions within a community or area, and it can help to determine whether the impacts of policies or programs fall disproportionately on one group or population. So that's an example of distributional equity. Transgenerational equity, this last pillar here, is a bit difficult to kind of conceptualize, but it typically involves decision makers to consider the impacts of decisions on future generations, particularly regarding the initiatives they develop around clean energy. So an example of this could be creating programs intentionally in a way that prevents future harm to communities, such as through creating a plan for minimizing displacement due to rent increases. Identifying and creating a plan to avoid negative impacts from your plans is also a very important element to consider in the narratives for your building upgrade prize. So these are all four pillars that are housed under the framework that ACEEE uses. I'd like to make a note here that all four of these pillars are necessary to ensure equitable outcomes, and that the ways to address each pillar should be considered an iterative process. So in other words, there's no final achievement of equity at the end of any of these dimensions. They should always be considered and updated throughout the development and delivery of programs. And I'd like to make a note also that focusing only on one dimension at the expense of others is likely to keep things the same, sustain inequities. That being said, a large part of today's webinar will specifically focus on a couple of these, but we wanted to make a note here not to engage in one more over the others. And so that being said, a large part of today's webinar will focus on the structural equity pillar, as you can see from the title of the webinar. And recognizing the role of structural inequities that have led to disinvestment in communities that could greatly benefit from affordable housing and underserved commercial building retrofits. Recognizing this pillar, acknowledging the historical processes that have led to institutionalized inequities, and moving to an understanding of how these inequities can be addressed and prevented in the future as a way of ensuring transgenerational equity is an important takeaway of this webinar. Another dimension we'll be touching on later in the presentation is the use of procedural equity to consult community members and community-based organizations to prioritize and understand the needs of disinvested communities and supplement the quantitative data that is readily available. So taken together, all four of these pillars can help guide and create pathways for equitable outcomes in project processes and outcomes. So as we move throughout the webinar, we'd encourage folks to think about all of these considerations that fall under these pillars and why. And really, this is to help think about energy equity in a holistic way and hopefully internalize these pillars in the projects that your teams will be working on in the future. So now that I've explained the 4 pillars of energy equity, I wanted to begin the discussion by looking specifically at the ways that structural inequities show up in housing and energy. Having this background is important to having a holistic understanding of both the unique and potentially shared challenges of communities, and particularly communities of color. So remember that for the Buildings Upgrade Prize, this is an important foundation for demonstrating that you fully understand the challenges to building upgrades in your building upgrade zone, especially for those in the equity track and for teams who have zones with residential buildings composed of underserved communities, for example. You'll also be required to demonstrate that you've considered the negative impacts that could potentially come out of the projects and find ways to mitigate the unintended consequences down the line. So we'll get more into that in future slides. But for this one in particular, like I mentioned, we'll focus on structural inequities through historical policy. So there are too many examples of how the US government and other institutions of power have intentionally created policies that resulted in disinvestment of communities of color. And a particularly relevant example of how racist policies that have led to disinvestment and reduced opportunity for wealth generation in communities of colors can be seen through, for example, the practice of redlining. Redlining was a practice endorsed by the US government and practiced by the Homeowners Loan Corporation. And it was a process to color code and designate areas that were where there was a presence of communities of color and color them as bad investments for underwriting mortgages. And this effectively led to the disinvestment of entire neighborhoods. So this map on the slide here is a real redlining map that was used to make housing investment decisions. And it's a powerful image of how neighborhoods were deemed unworthy of investment. And many of these original maps are available today in a project called Mapping Inequality through the University of Richmond, which again, we list as a resource at the end of the presentation. Another example that we cover in the slide includes racial covenants. Racial covenants were used to exclude communities of color from buying or occupying land. The excerpt here that you see at the bottom of the screen is a real racial covenant clause. And according to the University of Minnesota's Mapping Prejudice Project, which focuses on the impact of racial covenants in real estate, the families who owned houses with covenants were able to pass that value on to the next generation. This intergenerational transfer of assets continues to drive the racial wealth gap in the US today. So again, this source here is from University of Minnesota's Mapping Prejudice Project, which we list as a resource for folks to reference. Some other examples of policies that have impacted housing quality, jobs, and energy and water bills for low-income households and communities of color include, but are not limited to, things like mass incarceration, employment discrimination, and underfunding schools, to name a few. And these policies have fostered a lot more inequalities in low-income households and communities of color that have resulted in the concentration of these communities to be in areas with poor quality housing, poor quality infrastructure, greater pollution, the presence of food deserts, and fewer opportunities to high quality jobs. In these next few slides, we'll spend some time looking at other relevant consequences of these structural inequities that I just mentioned, which are often some of the main challenges that teams will need to understand and describe in their applications as well. So I've already mentioned inequities in housing and zoning that have created conditions for disinvestment in low-income and communities of color. Another particularly relevant challenge that stems from poor quality housing and energy inefficient buildings are energy burdens. And energy burdens are measured by dividing your annual income by the cost of your annual energy bills, which includes electricity, natural gas, and other heating fuels. ACEEE's most recent energy burdens report finds that the national median energy burden is 3.1%, and for low-income households, the median energy burden is 8.1%. Low-income Black, Hispanic, Native American, older Americans, and renters experience a disproportionately high energy burden. 1/4 of all US residents have a high energy burden, which is more than 6%. And 2/3 of low-income households were found to have high energy burdens in this report. And it's important to note also that energy burdens can certainly be pronounced in commercial buildings and other buildings as well. And in particular, ACEEE's latest research finds that for residential housing, weatherization could reduce low-income energy burdens by about 25%. So it's important to have an understanding of energy burdens, as it might be a common issue. And I'm going to hand it over to Michael.
Thanks. And so the overall health or socioeconomic well-being of a city or community is really a reflection of both the residential and commercial sectors. To isolate just one of them is not really possible when we think of what a community needs to thrive and exist today. And so this is just kind of introducing that notion and tying back in where commercial fits with respect to residential. The map on the right is from the Reinvestment Fund that conducted a market value analysis for Houston. This type of analysis considers different measures that assess the locality's real estate market and how these inequalities manifest across different subsectors. So the analysis here takes into consideration such indicators such as mortgage denials, percent vacant land, commercial land use, and redevelopment activity. And so I think this is a really useful way to look at aggregated characteristics of a city and its building sector along a geographic lines. And I think this truly reinforces the notion that areas of disinvestment are often cumulative and produce inequalities that fall along the lines of socioeconomic statuses. Next slide. And Cassie introduced some of the commercial building types earlier, but I just want to revisit them as useful information. When we think about what type of buildings serve communities from the commercial perspective, I like to categorize them in two main ways. And these are just examples. This is not an exhaustive list. The first being commercial building types that provide essential services for communities. These could be healthcare facilities, emergency response, as well as public entities such as schools and libraries. What comes to mind for me when I think about this is what businesses remained open and were deemed critical during COVID stay-at-home orders. And then the second category is more of this broader concept on what type of businesses and entities do we want to support and facilitate growth in within an area. And these can be businesses that might be underrepresented, such as minority-owned businesses, as well as other local, like community-oriented organizations that serve kind of as the gel between people and governance. Next slide. And now coming back to the energy side, we know that these disparities do percolate into seeing differences in building energy performance. This slide comes from EPA's Energy Star portfolio, where they recently conducted an analysis of what gets reported as the Energy Star score by building type. And what the study found is that there are disparities in energy performance that fall along lines of both race and income. Next slide. And lastly, just to try to piece this all back together, we're talking about very conceptual aspects of what produces inequality. How do we bring this into the realm of realistic and implementable energy solutions? And so this was something that is an area that people might want to interpret and approach in different ways. What I provide here are just some examples of how I've been thinking about it, and hope that they can serve as examples that you can then use and take to your project proposals. I'm just going to go over the first one, and then we can go from there. When we think about historical inequalities, we can think about what areas have seen underinvestment. And studies have shown that with respect to grid infrastructure, certain neighborhoods have been prioritized where others have not. This then leads to limited grid capacity that is critical and necessary if we want to see greater adoption of electrification technologies as well as DER resources. And so what does this mean from the community energy context? These type of disparities create and hinder opportunity for like local solar installers and other types of contractors to grow their business and to invest in projects within their local community. And then I'll just go through one more example here. When we think about disinvestment in communities, one critical thing that gets lost is the loss of a tax base. And when you have limited funds, you often see lack of investment going into those public buildings that provide critical community services. Dee mentioned the example with education, which is a very fitting one for this. And what's that lead to? That means that there are more buildings in certain areas that have had disinvestment that could benefit from building upgrades and retrofits. Next slide.
All right, so I'm going to take it back over. So now that we've taken the time to understand a little bit about how structural inequities have shaped the housing and energy inequities in low-income and BIPOC communities, we can start to think about the potential of the Buildings Upgrade Prize to address and prevent the continuation of some of these inequities. The benefits of this initiative can be directed to communities with the highest housing and energy burden costs. So some of the ways that this prize can start, at least, to address some of these inequities include by addressing housing and energy insecurity, addressing health disparities, investing in building upgrades in these communities, including retrofits, including communities in the development of plans that directly affect them to make sure that the benefits directly reach them, collaborating on mechanisms and ways to prevent eviction or displacement through these by these projects, creating procurement practices that center BIPOC community members and businesses, to name a few. So there's a lot of opportunity here, and it's important to sort of elevate that because obviously we just talked about a lot of pretty heavy things. That being said, though, we just spent a lot of time talking about themes of identifying and demonstrating a comprehensive understanding of the communities within the building upgrade zone and the challenges that they face that are relevant to this opportunity. And if you recall back to our discussion on criteria, there's one criterion that I would like to call attention to, especially as it relates to transgenerational equity. So this is criterion 2, addressing challenges through innovation, initiative scope, and impacts. So under bullet 4 in this criterion, there's a sentence that asks, what is your plan to minimize negative impacts? And a related scoring statements that requires a team to identify potential negative impacts to residents and occupants and describe preliminary plans to minimize negative impacts. So the negative impacts will, of course, be specific to your communities or building types, but some, like displacement or rent increase, are likely to be a common negative impact that teams will need to think through. If teams don't think through these potential negative impacts in an intentional way prior to commencing work, energy efficiency upgrades could lead to increased housing or building costs, which could potentially drive folks out of their communities, which is obviously something that we don't want to see. There are several ways that you can, that you and your team can start to develop plans or approaches to prevent these types of impacts. While we won't go into specifics, we do provide some really great resources and toolkits from HUD, PolicyLink, and ACEEE for teams to start to dig into and make preliminary plans to grapple with this sort of idea. And we encourage teams to think about their programs in a long-term way and embed the pillar of transgenerational equity in their plans when developing them to prevent unintentional harms. Now we're going to switch gears a bit to a poll. So please let us know in the poll, which of these issues do you believe are the most important to address for your community through the Buildings Upgrade Prize? Give a few moments for folks to input their responses to this. Okay, great. So I'm seeing high energy cost is the highest by a lot, actually. So followed by neighborhood preservation. Great. Thank you so much for your responses. I'm going to close this out and we'll move on to the next slide. So in these next few sections, we're going to talk about some potential data sources that you can use to understand and develop your narratives around challenges and opportunities in your building upgrade zone. And we realize that there's a ton of data out there, and it can be really hard to decide which sources to use. So some preliminary considerations when trying to make decisions about what specific data sources could best be suited for your project include considering things like, does the data source have up-to-date data? Data that considers contextual and historic policies that influence today's experience for low-income communities and communities of color. And perhaps most importantly, data that really considers the lived experience of residents and tenants of housing and commercial spaces. So like I said, we recognize that there are a lot of data sources out there. So when making decisions about what data sources to prioritize, it's often helpful to start with questions that you might have and work from there to see what kinds of data are available to get answers to these questions. So here are just a few examples of questions you might have that can guide your data search. And most of the tools that we mention in the following slides can give you answers or get close to estimates to help decision-making and eventually create a narrative for your applications. So some of these questions include, what geographic areas in my communities have high energy burdens or face energy insecurity? What are the ages of the buildings with households with high energy burdens, and what fuels being used? What are the what characteristics do these households or buildings have in common? What communities face other compounding inequities, such as being located near high polluting sources? And lastly, what are the unique histories or specific histories of inequitable policy impacts in our building upgrade zone? So these are just a few examples. You may have something that's very particular to your building upgrade zone that are not listed here, but this is just sort of an idea to help folks get started. So now we're going to go over some more specific tools that folks can start to use. We're going to start off with some energy and environmental characteristics data. So the first one we have listed here is the DOE lead tool. And this is related back to a point that I made earlier, which is that we know that high energy burdens are a huge problem and are closely linked to poor quality housing. So this tool offers a way to start looking at things like energy burdens. And the lead tool offers insights into average energy burden, average annual energy cost, and housing costs at the county, city, or census tract level. It also has information by housing type, which can be helpful for isolating trends. So for example, if you wanted to understand the intersection between energy burdens and income information in manufactured housing, this tool can be a good starting point for visualizing their location, in addition to identifying specific tracts that might benefit from retrofits. This information from the lead tool can be combined with other maps to identify neighborhoods of interest as well. You don't necessarily have to just use it by itself. That's a kind of a point we want to make here, is that a lot of these are very useful when combined. And just one last note on the lead tool here is that it offers both a geospatial view as well as a chart view. The next one that we have listed here is the National Renewable Energy Lab's Comstock and ResStock data visualization tools. And these offer interactive data sets that provide some more detail on things like energy usage and building characteristics. EPA's EJ Screen tool displays several indicators associated with environmental justice, factors such as the presence of lead, proximity to polluting sites such as incinerators, demographic data, and the presence of food deserts, for example. And this source can be particularly useful for describing intersections of inequities, if that's something that you'd like to demonstrate in your applications. And now I'm going to hand it over to Michael for some information on the buildings mapping tool.
I think you have to come off screen share first.
Got it.
Actually, can you go back? I'm sorry.
One sec.
Okay, and so I think we're sharing a lot of these different data sources as a way for you to have a resource to contextualize the issues of the building upgrade zone that you want to address, and to get the conversation started on what that looks like to implement a project. Rather than having you go to all these different sites, we thought it would be useful to build out a building specific mapping tool that is a combination of the key eligible building types that were introduced earlier in the presentation. And so I'm just going to walk through what those layers are here, and then we can do a quick tutorial on the tool. We are always looking to improve our tools as well as centralize and aggregate our tools so we don't have 50 different things out there from the Department of Energy perspective. This tool has three main data layers. The first is the Justice 40 data layer, which is what identifies specific census tracts defined as disadvantaged. We also added to that track a lot of useful data metrics that speak to why it's been categorized as disadvantaged and how does that relate to surrounding census tracts in that area. The second data set comes from both HUD and USDA, and that is data points of all publicly subsidized housing units. Within that, it provides additional specific information on what type of housing structure is that, whether it's Section 8 or federal housing authorities, and the number of units of those buildings. And then finally, we have a data layer that has key information about schools, specifically Title I schools. We also included within that data layer designation on whether or not that school serves as a community shelter. And for me, that's just a useful way to see where we could potentially pursue a resilience project with the building upgrade prize. If there's a region that is lacking a community shelter, and you could use the school retrofit to accomplish both energy and resilient benefits. And now you can take that off sharing, and I'll go into the tool quickly. Great, so this is our first iteration of this tool. And again, welcome feedback and suggestions on how it can better serve your needs and any other ideas you might have that would improve the utility of it. And so when you click on the website, when you enter it in, you first get this pop-up description of what the tool is, as well as all of the data that's underlying. Here's our map. In blue are all the census tracts defined as disadvantaged communities according to the White House, as well as tribal land designation and Title I schools, as well as affordable housing properties. I am based in DC, so for the purpose of this exercise, I'm just going to walk through my area. And that this top bar here, you can search by anything such as zip code, address. It's essentially using the Google Maps search engine to bring you to a specific location of interest. When you zoom in here, you see that the affordable housing properties begin to pop up, and eventually the Title I schools should as well. If you were to click on a specific census tract, you could then see some of those other indicators I mentioned. And these were data sources that at some point were used within DOE's definition of disadvantaged community. We've recently transitioned to using just the White House one, but because there's some useful information, we decided to include it in the tracks as well. Going from there, you could then pivot if you're looking to figure out what public housing units exist, and this will provide key information there. It will vary based on the program and what characteristics got reported to HUD or USDA. And then going back to the city level, let's pick a different area and see if the schools pop up. Great, and so this is for Arlington, just across the water. When you click on the area, the different schools within that district then appear. And so just another way to identify buildings of interest you might want to include in your project proposals. Passing it back to you, Dee.
Cool, thank you so much. All right. All right, so we also wanted to make a note here on tools that can be helpful for talking about sociodemographic and other housing data. And when we talk about buildings and retrofits, we can't just talk about them in a vacuum. We're also talking about people as well, of course. And so there are a couple tools that can help teams describe the communities and residents they might be working with to develop their plans. The US Census data has reliable information on demographic data and more that can go down to the census tract level data. It's always best to get as granular as possible. So getting down to the census tract level is a good start. For housing specific data that could be useful in this context, we also use HUD's community planning and development maps, which generate reports from a lot of different HUD sources in one resource. The National Housing Preservation Database provides a map of publicly subsidized housing, and this is also sourced in the mapping tool that we just mentioned, in case you would like to use this as a standalone resource and not use the tool. That's obviously fine as well. And we'd also like to talk about some local data. Some localities have data sources that can be especially useful when trying to understand conditions at a smaller scale, so the neighborhood or community scale. We list the list of minority serving institutions here as a resource and a place to identify potential project partners for, from local colleges and universities. Some other local data sources that might be useful to identify neighborhoods or blocks to target investments for retrofits in housing in particular include tax assessor parcel and property data, as well as CoStar data. These two data sources can be used to obtain property specific information such as total area of a building, the dates of construction, and owner names. CoStar and tax assessor and occasionally tax assessor data contains additional information such as dates of sale, owner and manager contact information, as well as any green building certifications that the building might have. Benchmarking data and utility data is also super useful. If your community has a benchmarking ordinance and transparency law, benchmarking data can be a useful way of gaining insights into energy performance of a specific building in your community. And like I mentioned earlier, some cities are starting to create their own data visualization or mapping tools that are very city specific. So be sure to work with your partners and identify tools that may be coming out or are already available that you might not be familiar with, which could be useful for getting down to a more granular level for your projects. And last but certainly not least, we wanted to highlight procedural equity and the value of quantitative data when it's used with qualitative data. We know that quantitative data doesn't always tell the whole story. CBOs, leaders, community leaders, and other local stakeholders have on the ground knowledge of underserved communities and disadvantaged areas that are not necessarily captured by the data sets that we just presented. That's why we also wanted to dedicate a section here to talk about the importance of using these sorts of data sources to understand the challenges and opportunities in your building upgrade zone. And we also wanted to make a note here that this is also community engagement in this way is also necessary for obtaining information that can guide the development of effective and equitable programs. So to offer a case study example of how qualitative and quantitative data can work together in the energy space, we highlight the example of Philadelphia, PA. And in this example, Philadelphia used spatial data through a mapping tool called the GEM mapping tool, which, as I mentioned, is more of a spatial visualization tool. In addition to focus groups to understand energy burdens in the city. So the city used spatial data as well as focus groups with residents and community-based organizations, really to confirm whether the data that they had accurately reflected the ways in which communities were impacted. So using both types of data allowed the city to work directly with community-based organizations and residents to inform their programs focused on energy burdens and energy poverty reduction, and really helped solidify a working relationship there to make the programs better. All right, so now we're going to switch gears again a little bit for a poll. So as Michael mentioned, we welcome your thoughts around the tool that he presented, the buildings mapping tool. So we wanted to ask all of you your initial thoughts on how we can improve the utility of the buildings mapping tool to best support your prize application and your organizations at large. We can open the poll. That would be awesome.
I think this one's actually in the chat.
Got it. Great. So if y'all could answer this, that would really help us in trying to get an answer of how we can improve it. So I'm gonna move on here. So we just covered quite a lot of material. So for the next steps, we sort of distilled it down to a couple of next steps that folks could take. And, you know, we figured that for all of these actors here involved in the Buildings Upgrade Prize, a good next step would be to come together with your partners and really align on your goals and what the outcomes of your projects will be. And you can try to start to see which of these, the guiding questions that we mentioned earlier can guide conversations and ideas for where to find some answers. So then after this step, you can start to find data to inform the building upgrade decisions and develop a strong narrative that demonstrates an understanding of the building types and challenges in your upgrade zone. So these are, you know, broad steps that folks can take because most of this will be very particular to your building upgrade zone. But in general, we wanted to make these recommendations. And with that, I hope you found this webinar useful. Please don't hesitate to put your questions in the Q&A. I'm going to hand it over to Carolyn for some final items before Q&A.
Great, thank you, Dee. And if you could go on to the next slide, please. So we just wanted to make sure to highlight some additional upcoming events to help you all as you're developing your prize submissions. We have another training webinar tomorrow that will focus on integrating workforce development and economic inclusion activities and principles in your buildings upgrade planning. So make sure to join for that one. On May 15th and 31st, we'll be hosting office hours sessions where you can drop in, learn more about the topics that we've covered in these training webinars and others that are coming up in the scoring criteria in the prize application, and ask any other questions that you have about the Buildings Upgrade Prize. The May 31st office hours will include a focus on the topics we covered in today's webinar, so we hope to see you there. There are also upcoming virtual teaming events to help interested prize applicants connect with one another and form partnerships to potentially collaborate on prize submissions. These events are organized by region and are hosted by Browning the Green Space. Last, there will be another webinar entirely focused on the structure of the prize and the application process on June 13th. And you can see more details and register for all of these events on herox.com/buildingsup on the upcoming webinars page. And before we move over to Q&A, we'll run one last poll with you all. So if you could go to the next slide, thanks, Dee. In which of these areas do you still have the most questions, and what would you be interested in exploring more of at the office hours session on May 31st? So if we could bring that poll up, and we'd love to hear from you all so we can make sure to address the needs and priorities that you have that you might bring to office hours on May 31st. And while we're giving you a moment to respond to that poll, please also be adding any other questions that you have to the Q&A box, and we'll be rolling right into Q&A in a moment here. All right, thank you so much for responding to the poll. That'll be really helpful for our presenters today and others that we'll have on the office hours in a couple weeks to follow up. So apologies for not introducing myself. My name is Carolyn Conant, and I'm with the R2E2 initiative at ACEEE, and I'll be helping out with the Q&A today. So we've got some questions first related to the Buildings Upgrade Prize that came in for Cassie during the beginning of the webinar today. First question was from Mary. Would county administration buildings or other types of municipal or local government buildings be considered providing essential services, even if they are located in a section of the county that is not considered disadvantaged?
So I would say for this building type, it's not a county administration building wouldn't necessarily be considered equity eligible outright. It's absolutely would fit within, the open innovation pathway types of buildings that are eligible for the prize in general. But if the team can make a strong case for the types of critical community services that that building provides in your particular community, then in that case, it could be considered equity eligible. So the types of critical community services could include, is it a resilient shelter? Is it a local food bank? Is it an arts and culture center for the community? So building uses such as that could make it equity eligible. There's more information about equity eligible buildings and that definition and how to develop your own definition in the section 3.5 of the official rules document on HeroX.
Great, thank you. And I saw that you added the links to both the English and Spanish versions of the rules earlier in the chat, and we can add those again as well. Next question from Kara. What are the criteria for the open innovation track? It seems like the equity component is encouraged but not required. What will these projects be graded on?
Yeah, so the equity-centered innovation pathway is the one that requires a minimum focus of 80% or more on equity-eligible buildings in your building upgrade zone. That pathway also requires a letter of support from a local entity representing the community in which you're planning to work. And that can be a community-based organization or a tribe. And that letter of support is only required if the tribe or community-based organization is not the lead organization applying. So that's the requirement for equity eligible or equity-centered innovation pathway. There's no requirement for including equity eligible buildings in the open innovation pathway, and there's no specific partnership requirement or letter of service required or letter of support required. Equity is still encouraged, and some of the scoring criteria encourage best practices such as community and stakeholder engagement, which is an important practice for any building upgrade initiative, whether it's focused on equity or market rate buildings. The official rules document, it outlines the full scoring criteria and provides all of that information in greater detail in section 5.2. So I recommend checking there.
And I think just off the top of my head, not being a pro with the rules document, some of the scoring criteria for the open innovation track include selecting adequate building technologies for the upgrade projects, selecting a building upgrade zone that demonstrates significant impact in a community in terms of getting those buildings upgraded, and demonstrating innovation in a number of categories and how you're overcoming barriers to scaling up upgrades. Does that all sound right?
Yes, thanks, Carolyn.
Okay. Next question from Allison. Is the goal of Buildings Up to identify good building retrofit techniques and delivery models that address and improve equity and energy burden outcomes, or to develop tools and projects that advance equity while also improving buildings?
I think it's definitely elements of both. Buildings Up is seeking to expand the reach of existing retrofit techniques and delivery models, but there's innovation that's going to be needed in order to do these faster than we ever have before and on a greater scale. There's also going to need to be a lot of innovation in order to do this equitably and to address the challenges like energy burden. There's a lot of innovation needed, especially in the areas of funding for upgrades, financing, workforce training and availability, and supply chain in order to complete these upgrades at a large scale. So we're looking for, yes, to actually do upgrades in a lot of buildings in your building upgrade zone, but also these supporting elements and infrastructure that are going to be required in order to do that equitably, specifically for equity-centered innovation, especially.
Great, thank you. Another question about project eligibility from Michael. We're a local two-year educational institution. Just to be clear, we can partner with the local affordable housing project and nonprofit housing and veterans projects for one prize. So sounds like address multiple building types within the scope of a single application.
Yes, absolutely. You can do all of those in one. And we encourage teaming like that. That's great.
Great. We've got a question. We might need a little bit more context. So please feel free to jump in the chat or the Q&A box for the person who asked this question. But the building they're interested in working on through their upgrade submission is in a city where a tribe owns two buildings, making it kind of a unique building type or ownership model, perhaps. How can we apply to get, or how can we fit kind of our goals for these buildings into the parameters of the equity-centered innovation pathway? What are kind of those key considerations for equity-centered innovation prize winners?
Yeah, so for this, so I first want to say we're looking for projects or ideas that are going to focus on multiple buildings, so more than just one building in your upgrade zone. The way this prize is structured is that there's going to be, we anticipate that there will be 4 different phases. So we're not expecting teams to go out and upgrade all of their buildings right away tomorrow once they receive the prize funds. We're looking for folks to share good ideas for upgrading a lot of buildings in their area over the course of a few years. So I just wanted to mention that first. Second, the place where you apply for this prize is the HeroX website that we've been referring to. And through this, through the HeroX website, there's a submission form for you to apply. In that submission form, you're asked to write an explanation or what we call a narrative for several different criteria that are going to evaluate your idea for your, or what we're calling your concept for your initiative. And that will ask you to identify what your building upgrade zone is, like the topic of today's training webinar. You'll also be asked to detail who you're working with, who your partners are, Have you done any community engagement so far, and who has that been with? What community input have you received? You'll be asked, what types of upgrades are you planning to do? You'll be asked to identify the challenges of your building upgrade zone, and that includes both technology challenges that might be an issue and also non-technology challenges, so workforce, lots of other challenges. And I recommend checking the rules document, which is on the HeroX website, to get like the full information about what's required there. Hopefully that answers the question.
Yes, and a little bit more context came in specifying that they're interested in working on one tribally owned building in a city and 2 buildings in the village. So maybe whether the building upgrade zone can be kind of expansive across an urban area and outerlying areas.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, you can set your building upgrade zone, and it can definitely be across different regions. Yeah, we're just looking for, a portfolio of buildings, whether that's in one neighborhood or across neighborhoods, across the state, it's up to the applicants.
Great, thank you. I want to make sure we have time to get to some of the questions that came in for Dee and Michael. So Cassie, maybe you could take a look at the Q&A box and answer some of their questions directly in there, and we'll come back to you if we get through these other ones. But one question from Maynard for you, Dee and Michael. Does the concept of energy burden apply to people on fixed incomes such as seniors? And if not, how else could we make the case for prioritizing upgrades in buildings for seniors who we know are more vulnerable to climate change impacts? Paraphrasing on Maynard's question a little bit there.
Yeah, that's a great question. And the short answer is that energy burden, yes, it can apply to folks on fixed income. The formula is just how much you spend on energy bills divided by your income. And if it's fixed, that's certainly probably gonna happen with folks that fall under this category. In the last energy burden report that it might have been the second to last actually, that ACEEE came out on energy burdens, seniors and elderly folks were categorized as a disadvantaged group, and that report specifically did take a look at energy burdens as it relates to seniors. So I'm going to drop the link to that report because it gives a lot more detail on how to kind of make the case for it that you might find useful. But I don't know if, Michael, you have anything else to add to that, or like a resource support to point Maynard to that could like get to this besides the report I just put in the chat.
No specific resource, just ideas, unfortunately, emphasizing that, like, figuring out how we can start moving towards more of an affordability standard, which at least opens up the conversation more objectively to how efficient a home has to be so that people on fixed incomes can have both heating and cooling and aren't curtailing energy use based on cost. And I think, like, right now we use 6%. If you exceed 6% of your income on energy cost, it's typically considered an above average or high energy burden. But I think flipping the script a bit more into looking at it from more of a standard and quality of life perspective opens up those type of conversations.
Great, thanks. That's really helpful. A question from Gray. Is there a federal definition of disadvantaged communities? This was a filter in the mapping tool that you showed.
Yes. Right now, per White House guidance, we're using the tool they finally released, which is not a cumulative burden definition for disadvantaged communities. It's more, it has different categories for burdens, whether it's transportation, pollution, energy efficiency. And if that census tract exceeds the thresholds and satisfies one other criteria, it is designated as being a disadvantaged community. Their tool went through a series of stakeholder engagements and feedback. And so they also added additional context for like a community, like surrounding census tracts to one that's being identified as disadvantaged, so that we can have a more fluid or flexible understanding of prioritization.
And would you be able to, if there's any kind of links that summarize that definition or where it's available, could you add those to the chat, please, Michael? Another question from Maynard. A lot of affordable housing is not publicly subsidized. What are some ways to identify those buildings, naturally occurring affordable housing in communities?
That's a really tough thing to take a look at. And I think Michael kind of alluded to this in like one of the responses to the Q&A. I think the best start, one of the ideas that I had in the presentation are tax assessor parcel data and CoStar data. Those can start to get you closer to answering who owns certain buildings, because you're right. Some of this stuff, you know, it's not public on these data sets. Like HUD has all of that information, most of that information publicly available. But if folks own affordable housing that's not subsidized, it's a lot harder to kind of identify. So if you have an idea of an area that may have some sort of unsubsidized affordable housing, sometimes it's called naturally occurring affordable housing, which is no more than 30% of your income. That's a good start, but I don't have a very clean answer. It's really tricky to get down to this level. There's a resource that comes to mind in particular that I can share with folks, and it's from I think Georgia Tech tried to get closer to this sort of idea, but it's not perfect, and I can certainly share that if folks like. Welcome other folks' ideas on how to sort of look for naturally occurring affordable housing, because that's a tricky question.
Cassie or Michael have any suggestions to add? Yeah, as Dee said, this is a really a tough question, and I think one valuable opportunity for pursuing that, like Dee spoke to a bit, is just establishing those community partnerships with folks who are more on the ground and out in the community, and can really help identify areas where there happen to be these pockets of naturally occurring affordable housing that are so crucial for maintaining affordability of communities. Got several more questions specific to the prize. Let's see. Can you please confirm that phase 1 is primarily focused on developing the concept and less on the actual implementation or upgrading of buildings?
Yes, that's absolutely right. This is the first step in developing your initiative and coming up with the idea, making sure you have partners in place or planned to be in place. So this is really that concept phase.
Great. And could you provide a little bit more clarity around projects and measures that would be allowed or eligible for single family homes if oil or propane are not involved in the project? Could weatherization and home performance work qualify?
Yes, so for this prize, we're especially looking for strategies that involve efficient heating and cooling equipment upgrades. That's a requirement to be within the scope. So in some cases that might involve swapping out equipment for these electric heating and cooling equipment, and then also efficiency measures, especially in buildings where that's required to reduce the energy costs. So those are initiatives that we want to see or strategies that we want to see.
Okay, thank you. And we've run out of time. We had a lot of great questions coming in at the last minute there that we weren't able to get to. But if everyone keeps an eye out on this FAQ document that I just dropped a link to in the chat, we will compile the questions that you submitted today that we didn't get to answer on the webinar. And we'll add responses to those questions on the FAQ document in the next couple of weeks. So please keep an eye out there. And you can also feel free to email buildingsup@nrel.gov with any questions that you didn't get answered today as well. So I'm just finding the link for that email. And with that, thank you so much to Cassie and Dee and Michael for your presentation today. And thanks to everyone for joining us. Really appreciate you and hope that we see you again on another webinar and upcoming office hours and teaming events. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks so much.